The tower stands still. Its ancient stones, pale and unmoved, have seen centuries pass, emperors, invaders, lovers, traitors. On the outside, the ravens hop freely, untouched by time. But on the inside, there are whispers. And if you listen quietly, past the wind brushing against the battlements, past the distant toll of bells fading into sleep, you may hear them. Before it was a prison, the Tower of London was a symbol, not of punishment, but of power. Commissioned by William the Conqueror in the 11th century, it rose like a clenched fist on the banks of the Thames, a warning to rebels, a fortress for kings. But over time, it changed. The stones grew colder. The walls echoed not with trumpets, but with footsteps, measured, muffled, hesitant. And the faces seen peeking from barred windows were no longer soldiers, but prisoners. And it's there, in those quiet chambers, that our story begins. Let us return to the year 1241. Ranulph de Glanville was not a famous man. Not truly. He had served the crown, faithfully, quietly, like thousands of others. A clerk, a witness, a hand in ink-stained robes who had once copied laws for the court of Henry III. His name rarely appeared in records, only once or twice in passing. But then, one spring, it appears again. Detained for suspected correspondence with foreign agents. No trial, no hearing, only a brief note in the pipe rolls, the official financial records of the English crown. He was taken quietly, at dusk, from his small home outside Westminster. His wife, Eleanor, wasn't home. She'd gone to visit her sister in Canterbury. When she returned, the house was cold and empty. A few papers still sat on the desk, one unfinished letter, addressed to someone named Guillem, written in a mixture of Latin and a southern dialect she didn't understand. Ranulph never came home again. In the outer ward of the tower, not far from the Wakefield Tower, there is a chamber, small and square, carved partly into the wall itself. In later centuries, it would be referred to simply as Cell 27. Historians are unsure of who exactly stayed there, but records suggest that in 1241, a prisoner named R.G. was detained in a solitary chamber near the armory. It was cold, damp. A single slit in the wall allowed moonlight in, thin as a blade. There were no books, no candles, no straw mattress. Ranulph, if he was indeed the man in Cell 27, had only his mind to keep him company. And in the dark, it wandered. On the fourth night, Ranulph began to speak to the walls. Not in madness, not yet, but in memory. He would whisper softly, almost prayerfully, repeating the names of legal treatises he once copied, of friends he once drank with. Petrus, he'd murmur. Auctoritas, causa 68. Not guilty. He remembered the smell of hot wax, the sharp sting of quills on his fingertips, the laughter of his daughter when she used to visit the scriptorium and dip her fingers into the ink pot. But most often, he remembered the sea. Ranulph was born in Dover, where waves crashed against white cliffs like endless hammers on stone. On quiet nights in the tower, when the wind curled just right through the corridors, he would close his eyes and pretend the sound was not the wind, but the ocean, calling him back. Sometimes he'd whisper, "Just a little further, down the shore, Eleanor waits." It wasn't long before Ranulph heard footsteps outside the door. Not the heavy steps of a guard, but something softer, barefoot perhaps, hesitant. He listened for hours, night after night. And eventually, the footsteps began to whisper. She introduced herself as Alice, daughter of a fishmonger. arrested for smuggling letters out of the tower to a man accused of sedition. She had once brought bread to a condemned man. Now she too waited in silence. Ranulph never saw her. The walls between their cells were thick, but not absolute. A small crack between two stones allowed voices to pass. Each night, they would speak, in Latin, in French, in broken English, of poems, of gardens, of bread, and of fear. Outside, the ravens came and went. The yeoman warders, later called beefeaters, fed them. Some believed if the ravens ever left the tower, the kingdom would fall. Ranulph, like many before him, had watched them from his narrow window. He began to name them. Caesar was bold. Agnes had a bent wing. The one with red in his feathers, he called Justice. He envied them, not for their wings, but for their freedom. "They don't forget," whispered Alice one night. "They remember all who've come through." Ranulph smiled in the dark. "Then they will remember us." 3 weeks into his imprisonment, Ranulph tried to send a letter. Using bits of charcoal and the corner of a discarded rag, he wrote the words carefully, painfully. A message to Eleanor, to forgive him, to wait for him, to tell their daughter the truth if she was old enough. He slipped it through the crack in the wall to Alice. She promised she would try. She never spoke again. 2 nights later, her cell was empty. No sound, no reply. The silence was louder than her voice had ever been. Ranulph wept, not loudly, just enough that the ravens paused outside. Decades later, in a tourist guide written in 1887, a peculiar note appears. Visitors to the tower reported hearing soft voices near the Wakefield Tower during moonlit nights. Some heard a man repeating names. Others heard a woman humming. No records officially explain these sounds. But among the guides, passed quietly, not spoken aloud, was a belief that those imprisoned unjustly never truly left, that their memories cling like cobwebs to the stones, repeating their stories to the night air, hoping someone will finally listen. In 1321, nearly a century later, a new prisoner was brought to the tower. His name was Thomas of Lancaster, a noble, a rebel, accused of treason against King Edward II. As he waited for execution, he wrote a final letter. In it, he mentioned hearing soft voices in the walls, a man reciting legal terms, a woman humming. He asked the priest beside him if there were others imprisoned nearby. The priest replied, "No. These chambers are long abandoned. Today, cell 27 is closed to the public. The door is sealed, the stone is cold, and yet, sometimes, during heavy storms or full moons, guards still report hearing faint sounds. Not cries, not screams, just whispers. A voice saying, 'Not guilty.' Another voice humming faintly, as if remembering a lullaby from a lifetime ago. And footsteps. Soft, barefoot, searching for a way out. Have you ever stared at an ancient wall and felt as if time itself was imprisoned inside? The Tower of London holds more than just stone and brick. It holds whispers. Whispers of souls forgotten, of stories left half told. Among them was a man named John Gerard. His name, though small in print, echoes in the silence of those walls. Gerard was a Jesuit priest, a Catholic man of faith at a time when to be so in Protestant England was treason. He was accused of spreading Catholicism, but in truth, his only crime was conviction. In 1597, they brought him to the tower. As the great iron gates clanged shut behind him, there was no panic in his eyes. Strangely, he was calm. He knew the tower wasn't just a prison, it was a stage, and he had just stepped into the next act of his life. They placed him in a cold cell in Beauchamp Tower, where light hardly entered and voices never reached. The wind whistled through cracks in the stone. Somewhere, faint and distant, church bells rang. But inside, there was only silence. Gerard was not a man to waste away. In the gloom, he began to write. He smuggled a message to the world outside. "Time has stopped here," he wrote. "The walls breathe. Every night, I hear the voices of those who came before me. I am alone, but I am not lonely." In that sentence, he was not just writing. He was speaking for every prisoner who had ever lived in the tower's shadow. Gerard eventually did the impossible. He escaped. Slipping past the same guards who believed him broken, he disappeared into the night. The tower was meant to be impenetrable, but John Gerard's spirit was stronger than its stone. He was never captured again. Some say he became a ghost himself, free but always watching. But Gerard was only one whisper in a sea of them. In 1595, another name was entered into the tower's ledgers. Arbella Stuart. She was royalty, a cousin to Queen Elizabeth I. Some believed she had a stronger claim to the throne than the Queen herself. But Arbella didn't hunger for power. She hungered for love. She married in secret a man named William Seymour, also a royal by blood. Their union wasn't political, it was human. But to the crown, it was treachery. Love, in the tower's history, was rarely allowed to survive. Arbella was taken and locked inside. They gave her a room with a window, but the kind of window that lets in light, not hope. She wrote letters too, desperate, fading with ink and fear. Her health crumbled. She refused food. She died alone in her chamber, her love never to see her again. She wasn't given a monument, nor a proper farewell. Just silence. 2 lives. Gerard, who escaped, and Arbella, who faded. The tower holds both their echoes. Go back further now, to the year 1483. 2 young boys, barely more than children, arrived at the tower. Edward and Richard, princes of the House of York. They were sons of a king, heirs to a crown. Their uncle, Richard III, brought them to the tower, supposedly for their protection. But they were never seen again. Did they die? Were they murdered? Or were they simply erased? No one truly knows. Their fate remains a haunting question mark in English history. Their bones were never officially identified. Their story is a gap in the record, a pause in the rhythm. But inside the tower, the stones remember. There is a small room in the Tower of London. Narrow, stone-lined, and dim. The kind of room where time folds into itself. On the walls are names carved into the cold stone with desperate hands, hands that had little else to do but remember they were alive. Some of the carvings are simple initials. Others are prayers. Others are poems. Those walls were once silent witnesses to a man named Thomas Abel. He was a chaplain to Queen Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of King Henry VIII. When the king demanded a divorce, Abel refused to support it. It was not politics for him, it was belief. And belief in the tower was a dangerous thing. He was imprisoned in the bell tower. The room was small, but his spirit was not. Day after day, he prayed, not for freedom, but for strength. He was eventually executed, but not forgotten. On the stone, scratched into the wall, were his final words. Thomas Abel, held prisoner 1533. Faith is stronger than iron. That's the strange power of the tower. It tried to end stories, but often it preserved them. Step softly now, into the Salt Tower. There the stone glows faintly with age. It's not lit by fire, but memory. In one corner, a strange symbol was etched. Circles, triangles, and a single eye. Scholars believe it was carved by a man named Hugh Draper in the 1560s. He was a Bristol innkeeper accused of sorcery. They said he was using astrology and magic to plot against the Queen. Draper never confessed, but on the walls, he left behind something more cryptic than words, an astrological chart. Carefully drawn, almost reverent. Was it a curse, a prayer, a final map of the stars before the earth swallowed him? No one knows. And Draper vanished from history. Only his symbols remain, and when the torchlight flickers just right, the carved stars seem to glow. They say prisoners in the tower were often given ink and paper, not out of mercy, but out of calculation. A mind distracted with writing is a mind not planning to escape. But the tower underestimated its captives, because with pen in hand, they built worlds far larger than their cells. Take Philip Howard, a Catholic nobleman locked away under Elizabeth I. For 10 long years, he sat in the Beauchamp Tower. He could hear his son playing in the courtyard far below, but he was never allowed to see him. 10 years. He spent that time writing, praying, and waiting. Waiting for release that never came. He died in 1595. The walls still hold his etchings. Latin prayers, a coat of arms, his name. Still there, still sharp, as if time refused to erase him. And maybe it did. But some prisoners were not noble. They weren't clergy or royalty. They were merchants, soldiers, strangers caught in political tides. In 1745, during the Jacobite Rebellion, many Scots were captured and brought to the Tower. Some had fought for Bonnie Prince Charlie, others were merely accused. One man, whose name is now lost, carved only a single line into the wall. Home. I dream of it, that's all. No dates, no explanation, just the ache of a man torn from everything he knew. That's what makes the Tower terrifying. Not the executions, not the chains, but the dreams that were smothered inside it. Dreams of letters never sent, children never hugged again, places never seen twice. There's one room in the Tower known to some as the haunted cell. No one famous died there. No great name is attached to it. But the staff refuse to enter it at night. They say the air turns cold. They say the walls weep. And once, a visitor found words scratched into the stone that hadn't been there the day before. Still here. Whether it was a prank or a message, no one knows. The writing was gone the next morning. But it makes you wonder, how many forgotten names lie buried under centuries of dust? How many voices whispered their stories into stone, hoping someone, anyone, would one day hear? We often think of the Tower as a place of endings. But for many, it was only a pause, a slow fading, a slow silence. Lives ended not with the clang of a sword, but with the quiet closing of a wooden door. Sir Walter Raleigh knew this silence better than most. Once a favorite of Queen Elizabeth, Raleigh was imprisoned in the Tower more than once. His final stay lasted 13 years. During that time, he was not idle. He wrote the history of the world while looking out of a narrow window. He cultivated a garden. He taught his son Latin. His mind stretched far beyond the walls. When he was finally taken out to be executed in 1618, he wore his finest clothes. He joked with the executioner. He said, "Strike, man, strike." But even as his body fell, his mind, his words, remained in the Tower, pressed between the lines of books, lingering in the dust of his study, resting in the roots of the garden he once tended. What if the Tower is not a prison? What if it's a library of souls? Each cell a chapter, each scratch in the stone a footnote, each shadow a sentence left unfinished. And among them, Somewhere deep in the lower chambers where sunlight cannot reach, there is a door. Small, rotting, iron-bound. No one opens it anymore, no tourists pass by it. But behind it, they say, is a staircase. It leads nowhere. But those who have climbed it say they felt watched. Not by eyes, but by memory. Not all who entered the tower left with a mark. Some disappeared entirely. But the tower never forgets. Not truly. There's a story passed among the yeoman warders, the beefeaters. It's never told officially, but it's whispered. They say that sometimes, when the moon is low and the fog rolls thick along the Thames, a candle appears in a window of the Wakefield Tower. But there is no one assigned to that tower at night. And yet, the light flickers steadily. They say it's someone still writing, still waiting, still hoping to be heard. And maybe they are, because you are listening now. You followed these names, these stories, down corridors of time and shadow. And in doing so, you've helped them breathe again. The tower stands still, but its memory does not. Every stone is engraved with sorrow. Every hallway hums with quiet defiance. The forgotten prisoners were never truly forgotten. They were waiting for you. There is a chamber in the tower known as the Queen's House. Beautiful, timbered, almost warm. But warmth in the tower is a strange illusion, because it was here in 1606 that Guy Fawkes was questioned. His name is known, but the man is not. Fawkes was no lone villain. He was one of 13 conspirators, part of the infamous gunpowder plot to blow up Parliament and end Protestant rule. Caught beneath Westminster with barrels of powder, he was brought to the tower under heavy guard. And there, he was broken. They began gently. They ended with the rack. It's said his screams echoed across the courtyard at night. The tower had no interest in secrets. It wanted confessions. Loud, public confessions. His signature on his confession barely looked human, jagged, weak, trembling. But here's what history rarely asks. What was Guy Fawkes thinking after it all failed? Sitting in a cold stone room, his body torn, knowing his friends were being hunted, knowing his name would live on, but not his side of the story. Did he regret it? Did he still believe? There are no carvings from Guy Fawkes, no quotes, no prayers, only silence. Perhaps that is louder than any word. The tower had its share of loud stories, but just as many passed like whispers. There is a lesser-known tale of a man named John Gerard, a Jesuit priest arrested in 1594 during a time when Catholicism was treated as treason. He was tortured in the tower, racked so violently that his wrists bled for weeks. But he never confessed. And then, something remarkable happened. He escaped. With help from allies outside, Gerard used an orange to write invisible messages with juice. He timed the guards. He planned carefully. And one night, he climbed out using a rope across the moat and disappeared into the fog. The tower, built to be unbreakable, had failed to contain belief. Gerard later wrote a book about his escape. His voice survived where so many others were silenced. It reminds us, not every tower tale ends in blood. Sometimes, they end in fire. In 1780, during the Gordon riots, angry Protestant mobs marched across London, burning Catholic chapels and attacking prisons. At the tower, they tried to storm the gates. The guards held firm. Inside, the prisoners heard the shouting, the chaos, the panic. For a brief moment, it must have felt like the outside world was breaking in, that the tower might fall. It didn't. But those inside were left with something new. Hope even if short-lived. But not every prisoner hoped. Some surrendered. Like William Penn. Long before he founded Pennsylvania, Penn was imprisoned in the Tower in 1668 for writing a religious pamphlet. He was only 24. But when offered release on the condition that he retract his beliefs, he refused. So they locked him in a cold cell. He wrote, "My prison shall be my grave before I budge a jot, for I owe my conscience to no mortal man." He spent 8 months there, and yet those months hardened him into the man who would later cross an ocean and build a city on the ideals of tolerance and freedom. The Tower tried to shrink him. It made him larger. Sometimes we don't understand a place until we see who it tried to break. Walk with me now to a lesser corridor, one not on the tourist path. It leads downward. The light fades. The air grows tight. Here, there is no beauty, only damp. Moldavian echoes. This is where the common prisoners were kept. Not queens, not lords, just people. People caught up in someone else's war or someone else's lie. Their names were never recorded. Their fates were unmarked. But they were here. You can still feel them. The grooves in the stone where fingers clawed. The rusted rings where chains once hung. The faint scratch of initials that no historian has ever traced. One reads simply, "Help me." No punctuation, no date. Just a voice, trapped forever in limestone. Above ground, the Tower shows the royal face of history. But beneath it, there is something older, more honest. The Tower is not just a monument. It is a memory of suffering. But suffering did not always mean silence. Some prisoners sang. It's said that Anne Askew, a Protestant reformer, sang hymns as she was tortured. She was racked so severely that she could no longer walk. And yet, as they wheeled her into her execution in 1546, she sang aloud. She was burned at the stake. Her ashes may be gone, but her songs, whispered by those who loved her, carried through generations. In some dark way, the Tower amplified her voice. It tried to erase her and instead made her eternal. The Tower does that, again and again. It tries to silence, and instead, it magnifies. One story, rarely told, is that of Elizabeth Throckmorton. She was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth I and secretly married Sir Walter Raleigh without permission. For this offense, both she and Raleigh were imprisoned, not for treason, for love. She spent months confined within the Tower, not knowing if she would see her husband again. She gave birth to their son while still under house arrest, and when Raleigh was executed years later, she carried his embalmed head with her in a red velvet bag for the rest of her life. That, too, is a kind of imprisonment. Not by walls, but by memory. How many walked free from the Tower only to remain its prisoners forever? Even those who survived it rarely left it behind. Their dreams returned there, their fears returned there, and maybe their souls never really departed. There's a saying among the yeoman warders, you don't leave the Tower leaves you, and yet tourists pass through it now. Laughing, pointing, taking photographs. Most never hear the whispers, but some feel it, a shiver on the back of the neck, a cold breeze where there should be none, a moment of quiet that hangs too long. That is the Tower remembering itself, and asking you to remember it too. It's not the blood that defines the Tower. It's the breath of thousands drawing in air for the last time, or for the first time after release. That breath lingers, and as long as someone listens, the Tower speaks, even now, even here. When the sun rises over the Tower of London, It casts long shadows, not just from the battlements or the beefeaters standing watch, but from something older, something unseen, the weight of memory. The tower is not haunted by ghosts. It is haunted by presence. And in this final journey, we look not just at those who were imprisoned there, but at what they left behind. We begin in the White Tower. Built by William the Conqueror in the 11th century, it was never meant to be a prison. It was a fortress, a symbol of power. Yet within a century, it became something else. A cage for the dangerous, the unwanted, the inconvenient. The deeper you look into the tower's past, the more the lines blur between guilt and politics. Take the princes in the tower. Edward V and his younger brother Richard, sons of King Edward IV, were only boys when they were brought to the tower in 1483. At first, they were treated well, but over time, they were seen less and less. Then, they vanished. Their uncle, Richard III, claimed the throne. The princes were never seen again. Centuries later, bones were discovered beneath a staircase in the White Tower. 2 small skeletons. They were quietly reburied in Westminster Abbey. But the truth has never been confirmed. Were they murdered? Were they smuggled away? Did the tower consume them as it had consumed so many others? The silence around them feels louder than any confession. And the stones of the staircase remain cold, as if still keeping their secret. But the tower does not always speak in stone. Sometimes it speaks in echoes. There's a corridor near the Martin Tower where the footsteps never match your own, where you hear breathing when no one else is near. The yeoman warders say it's the lady in white. No one knows her name, only that she paces, endlessly waiting. Not all who haunt the tower are dead. Some were never really alive to begin with. There are reports, written in the early 1800s, of a ghostly bear appearing near the Jewel House. One guard even died of fright, collapsing after claiming he'd been attacked. Bears once lived in the royal menagerie at the tower, a gift from kings kept in cruel cages. Perhaps some part of their rage never left. But let's return to the living, to those whose lives were reshaped quietly by the tower. In 1603, Arabella Stuart was imprisoned for marrying without royal consent. She had once been considered a possible heir to the throne. Her marriage was a threat. So she was confined in the tower. Unlike others, Arabella did not face execution. She faced madness. Alone, grieving, her health failed. She stopped eating. She stopped speaking. When she died in 1615, it was not with a sword, but with silence. Her story is less known. Perhaps that's why it lingers, because it's the forgotten ones the tower clings to most. Those without monuments, without headlines, without justice.